I found my great-great-grandfather's name in a police file from 1890, and what I discovered didn't just change how I saw my family. It shattered everything I thought I knew about justice, love, and the darkness that lives in the silence between generations. By the time you hear what was written on those yellowed pages, you'll understand why some doors should never be opened, and why I'm telling you this story anyway. Because what happened to Eleanor Hartwell didn't end in 1890. It ended 3 weeks ago, in my living room, when I finally understood the truth. The inheritance of secrets. The box arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by a lawyer I'd never met representing an estate I didn't know existed. My name is David Hartwell, and until that moment I was a high school history teacher in Portland, living a perfectly ordinary life with my wife Sarah and our 2 daughters. I had no idea that my family tree concealed roots so twisted and dark that unearthing them would cost me my peace of mind forever. The lawyer, a severe woman named Ms. Pemberton, with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to apologize for what she was about to do, sat across from me in my modest living room and explained that my grandfather's cousin, a woman I'd never heard of named Margaret Hartwell, had passed away at 97. She'd left me her estate, which consisted of almost nothing except a small storage unit in Seattle and explicit instructions that I, and only I, was to receive its contents. She was very specific, Mr. Hartwell, Miss Pemberton said, sliding a brass key across my coffee table. She said you would understand why when you opened the box. She also said, she paused, consulting her notes with obvious discomfort, that you should burn everything after you've read it and that she was sorry. Sorry for what? I wanted to ask. But Miss Pemberton was already standing, already leaving, as if she couldn't wait to be free of whatever responsibility she'd just transferred to me. The key sat on my table for 3 days before I could bring myself to make the drive to Seattle. The storage unit was in a forgotten corner of the city, the kind of place where people store the pieces of their lives they can't bear to keep close but can't quite throw away. Unit 247 was small, perhaps 5 feet by 5 feet, and when I finally turned that brass key in the lock and lifted the rolling door, I found myself staring at a single wooden crate, old and battered, with my name written on top in shaking handwriting. Inside the crate, wrapped in layers of protective cloth, were bundles of papers, photographs, and leather-bound journals. But what caught my attention immediately was the official document on top, a police file from Seattle, dated 1890, with a case number and a name that made my blood run cold. Eleanor Hartwell, age 23, status, murdered. I sat in that storage unit for 4 hours that first day, reading by the light of my phone, and with each page I felt the ground shift beneath everything I thought I knew. Eleanor Hartwell had been my great-great-grandmother, though no one in my family had ever spoken her name. According to the file, she'd been found dead in her boarding house room on a rainy October night, her body positioned carefully on her bed, her hands folded across her chest, her eyes closed as if sleeping. There were no signs of struggle, no signs of forced entry. The coroner's report listed cause of death as laudanum poisoning, manner undetermined. But it was the detective's notes, written in cramped handwriting that I had to squint to decipher, that began to unravel me. Detective James Morrison had suspected murder from the beginning, but he'd been overruled by his superiors. His notes were filled with frustration, with underlined words and exclamation points that spoke of a man who knew the truth but was being silenced. He'd written, "The husband shows no grief, he shows relief. I have seen guilty men before, and Thomas Hartwell is guilty, but of what I cannot yet prove. They will close this case. They will call it suicide or accidental. But I will not stop. I cannot." Thomas Hartwell, my great-great-grandfather, the man whose portrait hung in my parents' house, stern and respectable in his Victorian suit, the patriarch who'd built the family's small fortune in timber, a murderer. But Detective Morrison's investigation hadn't ended with the official case closure. That's what Margaret's collection revealed. For 2 years after Eleanor's death, Morrison had continued investigating on his own time, filling journal after journal with observations, interviews, and evidence that painted a picture so horrific I had to stop reading several times to walk outside and breathe. Eleanor Hartwell had been trapped. She'd come to Seattle from Boston in 1887 as a mail order bride, answering an advertisement Thomas had placed in a newspaper. She'd been an orphan, 19 years old, hoping for a fresh start and a kind husband. What she'd found instead was a man whose respectability was a mask for cruelty. Morrison had tracked down 3 former housekeepers who'd worked for the Hartwells, and their testimonies, taken in secret because they feared retribution, described years of systematic abuse. Thomas had been careful never to mark Eleanor's face, never to let his violence be seen in public. He'd isolated her, controlled every aspect of her life, taken her small inheritance for himself. And when Eleanor had finally found the courage to seek help, when she'd gone to a women's aid society that had just opened in Seattle, when she'd begun to plan her escape, she'd died. Morrison believed Thomas had slowly poisoned her, adding laudanum to her evening tea over the course of weeks, increasing the dose until that final night. But he could never prove it. Thomas was too well connected, too respected. He had friends in the police department, friends in the mayor's office. The case was closed. Eleanor was buried in an unmarked grave. And Thomas Hartwell went on to remarry 6 months later, to have children, to build his business empire, to die wealthy and honored at the age of 73. Detective Morrison's last journal entry was dated December 1892, 2 years after Eleanor's death. He wrote, "I have failed her. The law has failed her. God has failed her. But I will not let her be forgotten. I will not let her name disappear into silence. Someday someone will read this. Someday someone will know the truth. To whoever finds these words, Eleanor R. Hartwell was murdered by her husband, and justice was denied. Do not let her death mean nothing. I drove home from Seattle in a daze, the crate of documents in my trunk feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Sarah knew immediately that something was wrong. I'd left that morning as her husband, the man she knew, and I'd returned as someone haunted. That night, after our daughters were asleep, I told her everything. I watched her face shift from disbelief to horror to grief for a woman neither of us had ever met, but who was, in the most real sense, the reason we existed. "What are you going to do?" Sarah asked finally, her hand gripping mine across the kitchen table. "I don't know," I said. "Margaret said to burn everything. Maybe she was right. Maybe some things should stay buried." But even as I said it, I knew I couldn't. Detective Morrison had spent 2 years fighting for Eleanor's story to be heard. Margaret had preserved it for over a century, carrying the weight of this knowledge alone until she could pass it to someone who might know what to do with it. And Eleanor herself, silenced in life and death, deserved more than my cowardice. The next day, I began to research. I learned that Eleanor's unmarked grave was in a cemetery that still existed, now overgrown and largely forgotten in the expanding city. I learned that Thomas Hartwell's name appeared on buildings and streets, his legacy celebrated while Eleanor's murder was erased. I learned that the Women's Aid Society Eleanor had turned to had eventually become one of Seattle's first domestic violence shelters, still operating today under a different name. And I learned, through genealogical research that had kept me up for 3 straight nights, that Thomas's second wife, my great-great-step-grandmother, had also died young, at 31, of heart failure. Morrison's notes had mentioned her once, a comment scrawled in the margin, "Watching the new Mrs. Hartwell. She looks afraid, the weight of truth." It took me 6 weeks to decide what to do, 6 weeks of carrying this knowledge like a stone in my chest. I contacted the Historical Society. I contacted the police department's Historical Records Division. I contacted the shelter that had grown from the organization Eleanor had sought help from, and slowly, carefully, I began to tell Eleanor's story. The Historical Society was interested immediately. They'd been compiling records of early Seattle, and a detailed police file from 1890, complete with a detective's personal investigation, was historically significant. But when I explained what the file contained, when I showed them Morrison's journals and the testimonies and the evidence of how the system had failed a murdered woman, their interest became something more. It became a mission. Dr. Patricia Chen, the head archivist, was a small woman in her 60s, with sharp eyes and a sharper mind. She sat in her office surrounded by the documents I'd brought, reading with an intensity that reminded me of how I must have looked in that storage unit. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wet. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, "this isn't just your family's story. This is the story of countless women who were failed by every system that should have protected them. In 1890, a woman had almost no legal recourse against an abusive husband. She couldn't easily divorce. She couldn't own property in many cases. She often couldn't even testify against her spouse in court. Eleanor's story is exceptional because Detective Morrison documented it, but the tragedy she experienced wasn't exceptional at all. It was common. "So what do we do?" I asked. "We honor her," Dr. Chen said simply. "We tell the truth." Over the next 3 months, working with Dr. Chen and her team, we put together an exhibition. Not just about Eleanor, but about the invisible women of that era, the ones whose abuse and deaths were carefully papered over by a society that valued male respectability over female lives. We used Morrison's investigation as the centerpiece, his detailed documentation providing a rare window into the reality behind the Victorian facade of propriety. But the exhibition was only part of it. Through the shelter's historical connection to the group Eleanor had sought help from, we organized a memorial service. We found Eleanor's unmarked grave. It took weeks of searching cemetery records and cross-referencing Morrison's notes, and we placed a headstone. Not a small one, not a quiet acknowledgement tucked away in a forgotten corner. A proper memorial that read, Eleanor Hartwell, 1867 to 1890. Silenced in life, remembered in death. Your story matters. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought I'd done what Morrison and Margaret had asked of me, brought Eleanor out of the darkness and into the light. The exhibition opened to strong attendance. Local news covered it. The shelter used Eleanor's story in their fundraising, a reminder of why their work was still desperately needed in the 21st century. I felt I'd honored the dead and could finally let this chapter close. But 3 weeks ago, on a Thursday evening, I received an email that changed everything again. It was from a woman named Catherine Morrison, Detective James Morrison's great-granddaughter. She'd seen the exhibition, she'd read about Eleanor's story, and she had something to tell me. We met at a coffee shop near the museum. Catherine was in her 70s, a retired teacher like me, with kind eyes and her great-grandfather's determined chin. She brought with her a small box, its contents wrapped in tissue paper. My great-grandfather never married, she told me, her voice soft but steady. He lived alone, worked himself to exhaustion on cases no one else cared about, and died relatively young, at 53. We always knew there was something that haunted him, but the family story was that he'd seen too much violence, that police work had broken something in him. It wasn't until I was going through my mother's things after she passed that I found his personal effects, things that had been stored in our attic for generations. She unwrapped the tissue paper and removed a small leather-bound book, different from the journals in Margaret's collection but similar in age and wear. This was his personal diary, she said, handing it to me, not his case notes, his private thoughts. I've read it cover to cover since I saw your exhibition. I think you need to read page 47. My hands shook as I opened the diary and found the page. The entry was dated November 1890, 1 month after Eleanor's death. Morrison's handwriting was looser here, more emotional than in his official notes. I have committed an unforgivable sin, he'd written. I knew Eleanor. Hartwell was in danger. She came to me 3 weeks before her death, not officially, but by chance. We met on the street, and she looked at me with such desperate hope that I could not turn away. She told me she feared her husband was poisoning her. She had been sick for weeks, strange sickness that came and went, and she had found a bottle of laudanum in Thomas's desk drawer, though he claimed no need for it. She begged me to help her, but I told her I needed evidence. I told her to be patient, to document everything, to wait until I could build a case that would stand up in court. I told her that without proof there was nothing I could do, that her husband was too powerful to accuse without ironclad evidence. I sent her home to gather evidence. I sent her back into the house where she would die. I am as guilty of her murder as the man who poisoned her tea. I will carry this sin until my grave, and if there is a God, I will answer for it. But I will not stop seeking justice for her. It is all I have left to offer. I couldn't speak. Across the table, Catherine's eyes reflected the same grief and shock I felt. He loved her, Catherine said quietly. Not romantically, I don't think. Or maybe he did, I can't know. But he loved her enough that her death destroyed him. He spent the rest of his life trying to save other women, taking on every domestic violence case that crossed his desk, fighting his superiors constantly. He made enemies. He was passed over for promotions. He died having saved many lives but never forgiving himself for the one he lost. The diary contained other entries about Eleanor scattered across the years. Morrison visiting her grave on the anniversary of her death. Morrison tracking down Thomas Hartwell's second wife and warning her, though she was too afraid to leave. Morrison's growing obsession with changing the laws that had made Eleanor's murder possible to cover up. And then, in one of the final entries, dated 1895, Morrison had written something that made my heart stop. I have made arrangements with the law offices of Pemberton and Sons. The evidence I have compiled on the Hartwell case is to be preserved in perpetuity and passed to Eleanor's descendants when the time is right. Let them know what kind of man their ancestor was. Let them choose whether to speak the truth or maintain the lie. My failure was in choosing propriety over action. May they be braver than I was. Pemberton and Sons, the law firm that had delivered the box to me, the connection Margaret had used to ensure the evidence reached me. Morrison had planned this over a century ago, believing that someday justice might still be possible, even if only in the form of truth-telling. What do we do with this? I asked Catherine, gesturing to the diary. We add it to the exhibition, she said firmly. We tell the whole truth, not just Eleanor's story, but Morrison's too. The failure, the guilt, the redemption he sought but never found. Because that's part of the truth too, that good people can fail, that the system can break even those trying to fix it, but that the fight still matters. We updated the exhibition. Morrison's diary joined Eleanor's story, a parallel narrative of how intimate partner violence doesn't just destroy the victims but ripples outward, breaking those who try and fail to help. The response was overwhelming. Survivors of domestic violence came to stand in front of Eleanor's memorial and Morrison's words and weep for both of them. Advocates pointed to the exhibition as evidence of how little had changed in some ways, how women still struggled to be believed, how the system still too often protected abusers over victims. But something else happened too. Donations to the domestic violence shelter tripled. The city council, prompted by the attention the exhibition had received, passed new funding for victim services. A group of law students started a project to review cold cases involving domestic violence, looking for other Eleanor Hartwells whose stories had been buried. Change, real and tangible, blooming from tragedy over a century old. Last week I went back to Eleanor's grave with Sarah and our daughters. I wanted them to know who she was, what she'd suffered, why her story mattered. My oldest daughter, Emma, who's 15 and fierce and everything Eleanor never got the chance to become, stood in front of the headstone for a long time. She was just 23, Emma said finally. That's only 8 years older than me. I know, I said. Did she have anyone who loved her, besides the detective? I thought about that, about the silence in the historical record, the absence of family or friends in Morrison's notes. I don't know, I admitted. She was isolated. That's what abusers do. They cut their victims off from anyone who might help. She has us now, Emma said. She has us, and we're not forgetting her. And that, I realized, was what Morrison had been fighting for. What Margaret had preserved. What the exhibition and the memorial and the telling of this terrible was really about. Eleanor Hartwell had died alone and silenced, but she would not stay that way. Her story would echo forward through time, a warning and a witness and a reminder that every victim of violence is a person who mattered, who deserved better, who deserves to be remembered. I did eventually burn some of the documents, following Margaret's instructions. The most personal items, the things that felt too intimate to share, I returned to ash and scattered at Eleanor's grave. But the truth, the documented, verifiable, undeniable truth that I kept alive, that I made sure would outlive me just as Morrison had made sure it would outlive him. 3 days ago, I received a letter from a woman in California. She'd seen the exhibition online, read Eleanor's story, and it had given her the courage to leave her abusive husband. She's in a shelter now, safe, starting over. She wanted me to know that a woman who died in 1890 had saved her life in 2026. I keep that letter in my desk drawer, next to a photograph of Eleanor that Morrison had kept, the only image of her that survived. She looks young and hopeful in it, taken perhaps when she first arrived in Seattle, before Thomas's true nature revealed itself, before the isolation and the fear and the poison. I read the 1890 police files, and I do wish I didn't know what they contained. I wish Eleanor's story had a different ending. I wish Morrison had acted sooner. I wish the system had protected her. I wish I could reach back through time and save her. But I can't. None of us can. All we can do is tell the truth, honor the dead, and fight like hell to make sure fewer women follow Eleanor into unmarked graves and forgotten. Silence. Her story didn't end in 1890. It didn't end 3 weeks ago in my living room. It continues every time someone hears her name and remembers that violence against women is not a private matter but a public crisis. That silence is complicity. That every victim deserves justice even if it comes a century too late in the form of a headstone and an exhibition and a truth that refuses to die. I read the police files, I know the truth now, and I've chosen to make sure that Eleanor Hartwell's death, and Detective James Morrison's failure, and Margaret's lifetime of silent guardianship, and my own horrified discovery all mean something. I've chosen to believe that telling the truth, no matter how painful, no matter how long delayed, matters. Because somewhere, a woman in California is alive because Eleanor's story gave her courage. Somewhere, a shelter has more funding because people learned what happens when we fail to protect the vulnerable. Somewhere, a teenager stands in front of a memorial and learns that even those who were silenced in life can speak in death. That's what I've learned from the 1890 police files. Not that some doors should stay closed, but that we have a responsibility to open them, to face what's inside, and to make sure that the darkness we uncover doesn't stay dark. We bring it into the light. We name it, we remember it, and we use it to build something better. Eleanor Hartwell was murdered at 23 years old. She deserved better. She deserves to be remembered. And as long as I'm alive, as long as her story continues to be told, she will be